In this video, I will be analyzing the modern Northeast Ridge route. This route is widely believed to have been an option for George Mallory on his 1924 Everest summit attempt. In the second video, I will analyze the route into and beyond the Great Couloir. We will also look at another possible option in Mallory's mind, the so-called zigzag climb, which is located a little distance before a climber reaches Norton's couloir, and removes the problem of having to overcome the second step. In both videos, we shall be looking at, among other things, relevant photographs, climbers' reports, and adequate climbing equipment. It is important that we ask searching questions concerning the potential progress of the climbers, rather than label important and relevant issues as trivial. This questioning will be done in order to make judgments on issues which should determine if progress at certain locations was viable, and therefore more accurately gauge success or failure. Relevant issues include the impact of removing bottled oxygen supply, the perception of risk, and cutting steps on steep, snow-covered slopes. Step cutting and snow clearing on a climb is an important issue to explore in trying to determine how it might affect the climbers. Time spent cutting a step on a slope, for example, depends on the nature of the snow. One disadvantage with the hobnailed boots that they were wearing in 1924 was that traction was limited on hard snow slopes. One way around this was for the lead climber to swing the ice axe and cut steps in the snow and ice for himself and those behind. Another method is to simply kick the snow away if it is not too compacted. Since they did not wear crampons on summit day, which offer superior grip on hard snow slopes, this was their lot. In his 1937 book, Camp 6, Frank Smythe noted his own step-cutting experience on his way to the final assault camp.
Half a dozen strokes, and heart and lungs were working intolerably fast, and it was necessary to lean on the axe and gasp for breath, oblivious to all else but the vital need of oxygen. Slowly the lungs eased their exhausting pumping. The hands gripped the axe shaft again. Swing, 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 and again the crescendo of heart and lungs. So it went on.
One modern climber noted the importance of crampons, saying, "You need a crampon much sooner than you think you might. Once we are talking about hard-packed snow or ice, with rock thrown in, of an angle about 30 degrees, then crampons are essential." In the years after 1924, climbers who reached the summit of Everest were wearing crampons. Mallory had previously examined the north face with his telescope for possible routes to the summit. He told cameraman John Noel of his plans. There are different interpretations, and therefore different ideas from various commentators of where exactly Mallory planned to climb to the summit. For some, the ridge route, as taken by modern climbers, was his preferred choice. For others, it was a couloir route, or even a direct north face climb. With regards to his chosen route, or a combination of routes, Edward Norton's failure at the couloir days earlier would have been on his mind, as would the unknown terrain of the ridge climb. Did Mallory, despite his previous objection to the second step, but who could now examine it close up, deliberately climb here for this purpose? Or did he plan the route from the ridge to the couloir? His final plan, however, is perhaps not as important as is sometimes discussed, as there were few options available to him given his limitations on summit day, and so his actual climbing route or routes was very likely determined by the consequences of what he believed was too challenging to overcome. Since Mallory's oxygen cylinder number 9 was discovered near the ridge, we can state with a large degree of confidence that from his tent location, he made a climb up through the yellow band, and from there towards the first step along the ridge. This climb would have demanded some scrambling and cutting steps on steep slopes. With early oxygen sets being heavier than their modern counterparts, it should be noted that because the climb up is steep, it would have induced rapid, heavy breathing along with numerous rest points. This is an important issue to understand because, as climbers report, climbing to the summit is a slow endeavor. When Mallory reached the northeast ridge, he was the first climber to have been there. It is an easy thing for us to say that the second step route from his view now seemed doable. This is because the terrain between the first and second steps would be a dangerous traverse for those using rudimentary equipment. One modern climber reported that the towers, ramps, and ledges can make moving safely difficult, and the temperature can drop quite significantly when exposed to the wind there. With snow goggles over the eyes, it would not be easy to see where one's boots were being placed on the rock. Days before, Edward Norton took them off, except for moving over snow patches, so that he could have a better view of his steps. The risk of serious injury or death could easily be dependent on the traction of the boot nails on the climbing surface. The obvious reason for this is because of the slippery, steep angle of the north face with a drop of thousands of feet to the central Rongbuk Glacier below. For Mallory, who wore only hobnailed boots and was without fixed ropes, this section would be a huge test of nerve. In speaking of 1933 climbers Wager and Wynne Harris and their decision to abandon the ridge climb, Hugh Rutledge reported that they initially thought they could continue climbing there. But when they saw that the route ahead was difficult, they decided that it would be easier to traverse along the top of the yellow band instead. They determined that the second step was impregnable. Hugh Rutledge said,
"Knowing the men as I do, I feel very certain that their adverse opinion of the second step and its approaches carries great weight. They would not turn aside from a climb within the limits of the possible."
The point reached by Wager and Wynne Harris is the location on the north face where all climbers can decide whether to continue to make an attempt along the ridge or take the route into the couloir below the second and third steps. If Mallory decided to check out the second step, he would have faced one of the most talked about obstacles in mountaineering history. At the base of the step and before an ascent up the upper head wall, a climber must first navigate a climb up the lower rocks. At this altitude, it is not a climb which could have been completed quickly, and careful attention to detail without fixed ropes would have been paramount. A fall here could be brutal. The last section of climbing to the top of the step is around 5 meters high, depending on snow cover. In 1924, snow cover was low. Of the modern climbers who free climbed the step, they were mostly optimistic of the pair's ability to overcome it. In 2007, Conrad Anker and Leo Holding tried to recreate a potential free climb by Mallory and Irvine. Anker climbed it in Crampons, but without his backpack or oxygen. After a fall from the left side and a wait of 20 minutes, he then succeeded up the center of the face. His climb consisted of only 4 or 5 moves, including a hands-free rest before reaching the top. He said he was optimistic it could have been climbed in 1924. A Chinese report from their 1960 expedition stated that it took 3 hours for the climbers to free climb the step. They reported repeated failures, with long periods of resting between attempts. Other than falling off the rock face, the climbers also spent time driving pitons into the cracks in the head wall. But they finally overcame the face by employing the Kurt Eschel climbing technique. Mallory did not have pitons with him in 1924, but with Irvine's height and strength, it is clear that Mallory could have employed this known climbing technique if needed. While Mallory's potential capability here has been positively acknowledged by a few modern professional climbers, it seems clear that Irvine would struggle much more than we realize. He was not a skilled climber within Mallory's ability range. But was Mallory fully capable of completing this climb? In trying to finalize an answer, we should ask relevant questions. Could Mallory, for example, have matched the performance of the Chinese climbers? Yes, it seems reasonable that he could have. But perhaps most importantly, did they manage to overcome the lower rocky section of the step previously? And did Mallory then consider attempting the head wall, realizing that climbing up only solved half of the problem? While support climber Noel Odell always maintained that he saw one or both climbers at the top of a step, his statements over the years changed significantly. They ranged from the first step to a feature close to the final pyramid, and from one climber to 2. If he claimed he saw them at the first step, then a summit was out of the question, because 1250 is way too late for a safe return. If he claimed the second step, then it is very unlikely he saw them here. This is the case for at least two reasons. First, the terrain at the top of the step obscures the sighting of a climber until he is further along the ridge. Shadows at that time of day also make a sighting of a climber difficult. There is a small snow slope at the top, but from a long distance away, it looks tiny. Second, the idea that one or both could reach the top of the climb in just a few minutes, as he stated, climbing expeditiously or with alacrity, is just not doable. There are two alternative arguments to his sighting. First, he was referring to another rock feature near the ridge. Secondly, Shipton and Smythe in the 1933 report said that near to Camp 6, Shipton stopped and pointed.
"There go Wynne and Waggers on the second step," he exclaimed. Sure enough, there were two little dots on a steep snow slope at the foot of the cliff. We stared hard at them and could have sworn they moved. Then, simultaneously, we realized that they were rocks. And strangely enough, there are two more rocks perched on a snow slope immediately above the step. These again looked like men and appeared to move when stared at. Is it possible that Odell was similarly tricked by his eyes?
Did Odell see Mallory climbing the third step, the feature that was not considered a step until years later? The terrain between the second and third steps is relatively straightforward, and the climb up and over the step is neither time-consuming or difficult for modern climbers because they follow the fixed ropes. But if Mallory was seen here, then we should question why he would choose to climb a tall rock feature, as he could bypass the step on the snow to the right, as John Tinker said he did on his 1993 climb. If they were moving through cloud or were very tired, then avoiding unnecessary rock climbing would also make sense. If we accept Mallory's last sighting as the third step on the ridge, then a potential climb up the summit snowfield might have required a painfully large number of steps cut with the ice axe. The height from the third step to the summit is around 150 meters, and the initial incline ranges between 50 and 60 degrees. We can learn much from watching modern climbers as they slowly make their way up this incline and beyond. Despite the heavier weight of older ice axes when compared to modern ones, Ed Hillary demonstrated their successful use in his 1953 summit from the southeast ridge. Since Mallory's ascent would have taken much longer than the 1953 ascent, it indicates increased fatigue before a potential summit. Movement up the steep pyramid snowfield could have been much more difficult than what we might envisage. The climbing here is slow for almost all modern climbers using oxygen. If Mallory's oxygen was depleted or cached, then it could be a straightforward argument for a painfully slow ascent after many hours of climbing. Cutting steps in difficult snow conditions here would have been very tiring. But if snow conditions were conducive, then the number of steps cut may have been minimal. We must also remember that a climb up the exposed traverse below the summit and later back down it would be both slow and hazardous without crampons. Whatever the circumstances, it does seem reasonable to argue that Mallory could have made progress as he climbed towards the summit. Perhaps he could have reached the summit if he had sufficient time and nerve. But we have to be realistic if we try to place Mallory on the summit in a time which is similar to modern expeditions. We cannot overlook the obstacles he had to deal with and the long distance he had to travel within his limited time frame. Furthermore, since we know very little about his climb, we cannot easily superimpose climbing rates and state this or that happened at a particular time. If we accept that a summit from the ridge was achieved, then we must explain how and where the climbers descended, along with an estimation of the time that it would have taken them. If they descended by returning the way they had come, questions concerning their ability come to mind. Think, for example, of a scenario where they would have to beat the clock before light faded. They would have to complete a down climb on the second step without any rock fixings for their rope, along with being in a near-exhausted state. If one climber belayed the other down, then how did the climber at the top descend? It would have been seen as a terrifying prospect and a huge gamble on one's life. This scenario must have been in Mallory's mind if he was able to scrutinize the step hours before. If he refused to consider an attempt up the second step as prudence should dictate, and if he climbed as far across the north face as Norton did 4 days before him, then there were further significant challenges to overcome. Indeed, with the increase of climbing fatigue at high altitude, no certainty of consistent supplementary oxygen, with building psychological and physiological consequences of time pressure due to a late departure from camp, all meant that he would have to vanquish the mountain by conquering climbs that none of his pre-war peers were able to do. In trying to make judgments on Mallory's chances of a successful route to the summit via the ridge, we have noted some of the obstacles which would have faced him. In the next video, we will look at Mallory's remaining options as he searched for a route up. We will then weigh up all of the options in a final summary and try to make a final judgment.